Okay, welcome everybody to the Network Engineering Discord third quarter 2021 meeting. We'll just wait here for a couple minutes for people to trickle in. Okay, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So once again, welcome to the Network Engineering Discord third quarter 2020 meeting. My name is Alan Stewart. I am one of the admins on the server. And so as this is the being the current Discord networking server, we'd like to announce that we are going to be moving towards forming a network operators group, or a NOG, and we'd like to announce this as the Discord NOG first meeting. So we have the agenda here. At 7:05 p.m. UTC, we'll have the presentation of Flinging Bits for Fun and Profit. At 7:15, we're going to have Death to FHRP. 7:25, we're going to have community updates where Jason Rokich, the other admin, will go into some more of those details of the transition into NOG. At 7:35 p.m., we'll have a presentation on routing security and RPKI. At 8:05 p.m., we'll go to an open on-topic discussion. And at 8:30 p.m., we'll go ahead and transfer over to a social open off-topic. Also, there will be a survey at the end, and there is a chance for people to win a JetBrains license. And all you have to do is fill that out and include your Discord information and to enter for a chance to win that. And I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you, Hugo.
Great, thanks. So I'm Hugo Slybert. I'm going to be walking through the Fling Abyss or Fun and Profit is kind of an example career path in network engineering. So the gist is that we often see as folks join the server that they would ask, how do I crack into this? What do I need to do? What are my options? And I'll walk through kind of a high level overview of a network engineering career, as well as an example of how I will walk through it to get to where I'm now, just as a bit of a guide. So if we can move this ahead. There we go. It's a little bit delayed. So I'm a principal network engineer and a tech lead in NetEng at DMWare. We're part of Activision. So if you've played Call of Duty or Skylanders, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, any of those, and your console, when you fired it up to play online, you've hooked up to infrastructure that we help design, build, and operate. So that's where I'm at. So we'll walk through, like I said, just a kind of a high level overview of the career path. I'll point out some things that have served me well. So those are like general guidance. Why I picked this as a career, walk through some training and education options, and what types of organizations would employ network engineers, where you might want to work, and some differences between them, some ideas for getting started, cracking into your first job, and bits of my own path, and then kind of summarize at the end with some of the tips that we picked up along the way. So this is just the overall flow. The interest and choice is just you've got some inkling that this is something you might want to do. You can do this obviously without being somebody that's just buried in this all day, like the lab every day thing. Folks also do have careers, do have kids and families and other things to do, but you need that bit of a spark as well that say, I want to do this. Go through whatever your training education options are. Find a way to break into your first gig, and then sometimes it's good to revisit and see if you want to shift to a slightly different role. And there were 6 spots here in this graphic, but I only had 5 things, so we'll leave that one blank. I'm not going to walk through all of these right now because we'll step through them as examples, which point out in different parts of the career path or that I've found, but you'll just see the slide come back. So for the choice part, I wanted to get married. That's why I picked it, because I needed money and I didn't have any, or at least not enough. So we need some way to actually fund that. So what are we going to do? That's not me. So you don't need to be, you'll hear people say that as well, I was dialing out BBSs at X from my parents' basement or whatever it happens to be. You don't need to fit a specific mold of what people may cast as a stereotypical network engineer. So now I did enjoy electronics and taking some things apart and taking motors out of things and spinning popsicle sticks on them in order to see how they function. So there's that, and I enjoyed the science part of it. So when I was looking for, hey, I do need to get into a career and get started with this family idea, I started looking at different programs that might be related to electronics or to that side of avenue. So just as we're talking about those tips and tricks, don't, start where you are. You don't have to fit anyone else's specific view of what network engineering looks like or what a network engineer looks like. And you don't need someone's permission to say that you are or are not the type of person that could get it to this gig. If you want it, go for it. And I need to get paid is fine. Technology and network engineering in general have good compensation options generally. But I would say that you should have at least a good base interest, because that interest and excitement about network engineering or about the field is what will drive you to advance, and your curiosity that will help build up your success. So moving on to training education, excuse me. So you broadly the splits to formal versus self-guided programs. The formal programs are more of a guided path. Sometimes if these are pitched by universities or colleges, the information may be a little bit older because they may not advance as quickly. So there's that to bear in mind. The quality varies. They often do bundle certifications, so cert exams and such. If you can, look for something that does have a co-op or an intern program, because those can be a great foot in the door, especially if you find that the organization, the educational organization, has a good name in the industry or those types of connections. It can be pricey though, because often you bundle all that stuff together. Self-guided can be if you kind of have to be more on yourself for your training and be in control of that. So that takes more discipline. It can be a little bit difficult to know which things should I start with. And that's where places like this Discord can be quite helpful for people to give you guidance about what worked for them. There's so many like free or decently cheap or subscription training options available these days. You can plumb that stuff together. It's often also quite a bit fresher. You just need to sift through what's relevant for your part of your path. So it can be cheaper. It can be a bit more work to build connections. Whereas if you're starting in school, there's your classmates and your instructors. So again, like Discord or another community like this can be quite helpful. So I went the formal program route. This is the program I happen to do at a local tech college called BCIT in conjunction with the university. So it was, for my purposes, it was fast. It was a one-year program. So that was good. It bundled in soft skills as well as certs and a whole bunch of those. It was expensive though, it was like 18 grand Canadian. And it was more of a sysadmin gig, but that's also where I started. So that gets into, evolving as you go. Excuse me. Oh, that used it as a link, which is not what I was intending to do. Jason, I don't know if I can get out of this, if you'd be able to hop us back.
Let's see. It does not look like that.
Brilliant.
Oh my gosh. All right. There we
go.
go.
Okay, cool. Sweet. So I'll click somewhere else rather than on that. Sweet. Okay. So tips and tricks that are applicable here. You get what you put in. You get out what you put in. There are folks that just kind of were looking to coast through the program, and that doesn't help. Recognize you're investing in yourself. So do take the time because that's going to pay dividends. Just figure out what you want. This is up to your choice. I needed to sort out what I wanted to do. And I had support from family and such on the financial side, but then you need to actually put into work to make it happen. And the community part, participate where you can to make connections with your classmates, whether that's through study groups or social things, because those connections can serve you in the future. So getting your start, there's a few options that can be helpful. The one is if you're at a formal program, participate in study groups. I did that as leading one, and that often helps you also understand your material better, but that makes connections and can help you stand out from others in your class as well. If you're at a formal program, people often need help with the computer lab. So if you can do that, that can be a volunteer option that starts to build up your CV and make some connections and shows up as a work experience. Local organizations that are nonprofits often do also need volunteers as well if they're doing things like community computer training or finding low-cost computers and such for people in the community. So that's also another way to kind of start out. If you're at a formal program, like I said, co-ops and internships are a great foot in the door. And then things like this, informal communities such as the Discord here or NOGs, technical user groups, all the rest of that, meetups, that sort of thing. So now on to your first gig. This is just an overview of those different types of organizations. So ISPs or network service providers are a common one. You made entry-level gigs more like a NOC or a help desk. How much you touch can vary by whether they're small, like regional, or a big shop in terms of how much exposure or how focused. And those are just an overview of the type of things that you might touch in the service provider world. Managed service providers, they're kind of like a blend. There's a lot of different things you might touch. I said a grab bag of tech, so that could be like help desk, hosted services, cobbling together different SaaS offerings. The quality varies for the organization. Some folks are more like, let's just sell something, make a quick buck and get out, as opposed to solving problems for people. And you want to try and find the organizations that have a reputation for the latter. You get exposed to lots of different environments. It may not be super focused on one piece of tech, but it can be great as a starting point to get exposure. Enterprise, it's less common to have dedicated network engineers at an enterprise environment these days, but that might be something that's like a data center plus branch environments. How focused the tech culture is varies if it's a tech organization or somebody that sees it as a cost center. It's common to be a jack of all trades here again, so there can be lots of exposure, but it might not be as fast moving, so you may be playing with some older tech, depends. Network vendors, this is like working for Cisco, Arista, Juniper, whatever. Your entry levels are often going to be going into tech or that front customer service side. Lots of environments that we might interact with, but at a shallow level frequently, but you may dive deep on their specific hardware platforms and solutions. A lot of folks shift this into a design path thing where you're coming out of tech and then end up designing systems for different customers. It can be a bit more theory as opposed to having like on the ground operational experience or figuring out some of the business impact. But that can also, that can still be like quite deep on the technical depth. The last one, or not last, hyperscalers, this is for AWS and Azure and whatnot. Depends which level you get in. Entry level can be very siloed because at the high scale they operate, things can be quite tight in terms of processes. It can look fantastic on a CV though, like a year or two stint starting at these hyperscalers can get good recognition. And if you can shift into those at a higher level, these are folks that are solving, challenges that are unique to just one or two organizations on the planet. So lots of strong tech culture to work with, strong automation, and just solving interesting problems. And the last one is kind of where the type of place I'm now, which is a content shop. This is like your Netflixes and all that. Things that eyeballs and people on the internet want to look at. It can be very exciting, often smaller organizations, but with large impact or scale. A lot of the varied tech that you might get exposed to, and often have very strong technical cultures as well. So folks outside of network engineering and within the network engineering groups there. So I started out in the MSP side. And I mentioned study groups, right? So the study groups that I ended up leading helped me get a freelance gig with one of our instructors over a weekend, which then I was able to roll into the co-op program and into a full-time gig. So this is just to show that there's a lot of different pieces of tech. Again, I started on the sysadmin side that I got exposure there, and that helped me advance very quickly from help desk to more an architecting role. So the stuff that was helpful there is that, again, the get out what you put in. If you're showing in your learning in your initial gig, I advanced very quickly because I was able to start prepare myself with training on my own to the opportunities of projects that we had that came up. And then that, if you can land some of those initial or those more visible projects, that can help you advance quite quickly. I had a bit of a detour into a consulting gig, which effectively was just excuse me, I needed to slow down a little bit. That got too slow. So maybe that's not the thing you want to do, which meant that I had to assess if I wanted to pivot to something else. So I took stock of what I'd done so far and the things I enjoyed from my training, which is more focused on purely the networking side. So I shifted into trying to get to that into an ISP role. The place that I worked at was a regional ISP, and this was, again, when I said talk to people in the community, it's the lead architect at this ISP. This ISP was a partner for the MSP that I worked at previously, so we maintained that connection, and when they had an opportunity come up, I was able to roll that in. So this got me into exposure in the service provider field, dealing with IPv6 and DDoS mitigation, and general service provider tech, as well as some starting automation. So to figure out what you want, this is like that take stock, but then you've got to actually talk to people or figure out, sweet, I'm here, how am I going to get there, and then make those connections, as well as the talk to people bit I described of making connections in the community, because those things can come back and help you later on. I then shifted over to a content shop. This is where I am now. So this is Demonware's older logo, which I thought was a bit cooler, but this was a huge ramp up for myself. And as well as like a lot more automation focused on virtual solutions and network automation, launching games that, if you break it, you hit the front page of Reddit, as well as learning things like Kubernetes and more development and interesting network stacks. So just to show that there's lots of different variety of what you can pick up. The preparation part that I mentioned here is that I wanted to eventually actually move to a content provider like this. That was kind of the long-term view, because I like the smaller environments with higher scale challenges. But I had to work through and develop my network engineering skills. So at the ISP, and that's saying what I wanted to make happen, and did it. To take the pain away is something that can help you overall in your career. If you can identify pain points within your own team or the folks that use your team's tech, people will freaking love you. And that pays, that shows off in terms of compensation and career path. And the community and building bridges, that's something that also helped me stand apart in my current gig, of connecting with other teams and building those relationships and kind of like highlighting and elevating your own team and their tech and their reputation. And that will help you shine in the business as well. So the tips, I don't have to kind of walk through these again. These are the same things that I described, but start where you are. Is don't let anybody stop you. If you really want to do it, figure out that's what you want, then go for it and then put in the work. Getting paid is absolutely fine, but keep that interest and make sure that you've got that to drive you forward. And the rest we've already spoken about. The community, this is a great place, like this Discord itself, to start making those connections, and they can often serve you later in your career as well. So give what to in these types of settings, and people will remember that and want to kind of turn that back to you as well. The last bit I'll note is just this one that popped up before, is that people have been saying for like a decade that network engineering is going away, yet we're building more and more complex applications with distributed apps and such. So the future is bright, is what I'm trying to say. There's lots of possibilities for you. We don't unfortunately have time for questions, given that this was a lightning talk, but you can find me in the Discord afterwards, and in the not the Q&A, but the chat section, and we can possibly talk more. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jason for Death to FHRP.
Great, thank you, Hugo.
Cheers.
There we go. Hi, this is Jason Rokeach. I'm a solutions architect at Juniper. My history, my experience, and really my passion is in all things service provider, largely MPLS, but I also have maybe an unhealthy obsession with things like BNG, and all of that fun to play with on the service provider side. And I'm also taking an interest in how data centers make their way into service providers, as more and more service providers are requiring data centers in their environments. Today, I want to talk to you about EVPN. We'll go over some brief typical conversations and typical considerations around EVPN. One thing to note about it is, in an EVPN and VXLAN environment, it's near ubiquitous now in new data centers. Pretty much every new data center that goes in is being built with EVPN VXLAN. It's a very standard protocol for how you scale a data center, because it eliminates spanning tree issues. It eliminates the limitations of MC lag to only having 2 upstream links, and it has the VXLAN strength of being able to scale well beyond the typical VLAN quantity restriction. On the other hand, we have EVPN MPLS, which you see in a service provider environment. We typically talk about this as enabling dual homing of layer 2 VPN customer locations. That's kind of one of the big things that people talk about. We talk about it as a more scalable approach to building layer 2 VPNs, with reducing operator overhead by signaling via BGP instead of LDP, as Compella style L2 VPN does as well. But those are kind of the things that people normally talk about, and they are not what we are here to talk about today. What I want to talk to you about today is the tools that we have because we have EVPN, and how we can use those innovatively to do other things than the typical marketing slides, right? We have 2 main tools that I want to focus on. One is called an ESI, or a Ethernet segment identifier. There's also a virtual manifestation of that, that is a virtual Ethernet segment. And this is what enables that multi-homing that we talked about before. We can do it active-active, so you have 2 or more uplinks, or you can have active-passive. And what it does is it marks multiple interfaces as belonging to the same Ethernet segment, so you don't loop traffic without needing anything with like spanning tree. The other tool that we have is distributed anycast gateway. This enables me to have multiple layer 3 gateways without VRRP, without HSRP, any of those first hop redundancy protocols, right? It enables me to put the same gateway in multiple locations independent of topology, and traffic will route over the most ideal path within where those gateways reside. So we'll go through 2 scenarios here. The first one is a internet gateway redundancy scenario. And this is a very traditional model for a service provider environment. It's not the only one, but it is a very common one. In this environment, we have 2 gateway routers that are one clustered router. We have 2 aggregation PEs that are also one router cluster. And we have those 2 connected to each other via a lag between them with 8021Q signaling VLANs on a trunk. And then we have pseudo wires in MPLS from the access PE routers to the aggregation PE routers. There's some drawbacks here. The big one, which kind of drove me in the direction of needing to find another solution when this was in my environment, was vendors are deprioritizing clustering. The vendor that we had at the time had told us that, well, we needed to upgrade code because we needed new features, and the new code did not support clustering. So we needed to break that one router that's 2 chassis into 2 separate routers. Other drawbacks, that clustering can be complex. It requires either a shared location or additional complexity for building redundancy appropriately. You can definitely cause service outages by trying to add redundancy that doesn't work right or isn't managed right, or there's a bug. You can definitely shoot yourself in the foot with this type of thing. And the big problem that I have with this is it has 3 single points of failure. And yes, I'll call that out 3, because you have each one of those clusters is a single point of failure. It might not be a hardware single point of failure, but it does share control plane. It does share management plane. If you have an engineer fat finger or make another mistake, or you have a software bug, your entire service is down. So let's go to the evolution of this, right? With EVPN, we can get rid of these clusters. You see both the gateways and the aggregation PEs are no longer clustered. They are distinct separate routers. To do this, we build a layer 2 VPN on the access PE that has pseudo wires to both aggregation PEs. Both aggregation PEs have an 8021Q trunk to their respective gateway. Same thing as we had before, it's just now broken apart into 2. We add BGP with EVPN signaling between the 2 gateways and MPLS between the 2 gateways, although you could do this over VXLAN if you wanted to, if that fits better in your environment. And we enable distributed anycast gateway on gateways 1 and 2. The benefits of doing this are we now have a model that's supported by vendors. Everybody's dumping a lot of resources and has dumped a lot of resources over the past near decade into EVPN in these environments. There's no more single point of failure except for the place where the fiber connects to the customer. We don't need to go and overhaul our internet network by adding MPLS to the whole thing. We only need it in that one place. We don't need to add EVPN or have devices that support EVPN, which is going to matter in a lot of legacy environments in the MPLS network. There's one problem with this, one challenge, I should say, that is policing and shaping does become an issue in this active case. You can mitigate that by using ESIs to have only one be active at a time, or at least have only one link between the aggregation PEs and gateways be active at a time, and that solves your policing and shaping challenge. We'll go to our second scenario. This is maybe not as typical a scenario, but it is something I can say I've run into. We'll call this stateless access ring redundancy. And in the old model, the gateways might use FHRP, they might be a single router, they might use EVPN distributed anycast gateway like we talked about in the last scenario. But the big thing here is we're focused in on these 2 use cases down here, where this is fed by what might be a PON network, it might be DSL, but somehow this ring is Ethernet fed. We're feeding these 2 a home and a business. Those switches don't run layer 2 loop prevention, at least not in a meaningful way in this scenario. We need dual uplinks, and today you can see it's connected on both sides of that ring into one access PE router. Access PE runs spanning tree on its own, and it just blocks one port when it sees its own BPDU come back, because the switch ring just passes that transparently instead of participating in spanning tree. Drawbacks here are clear, right? There's one single point of failure that's an access PE for all of those switches, which might be a fairly wide geography. And the other thing is it limits our physical options. We have to begin and terminate each ring in the same physical location. We can't stretch that across geography, not without backhauling it somehow. So in an EVPN enabled model, we can move that link back, right? We can move that link somewhere else. What we do is we don't touch anything on the gateways. We don't touch anything on the switches. We just move the switch connections. One of them can go to a different PE. It can be the same one still, but probably should be a separate one. We still don't need spanning tree in the switches, and we now don't need spanning tree on the access PEs. The access PEs have layer 2 VPN pseudowires to both aggregation PEs, or they could just each have 1-to-1 if you don't have support for VPLS on your access PE. The aggregation PEs use these virtual Ethernet segments, which is that Ethernet segment on a pseudowire. So we are only taking traffic in one side at a time because we're enabling that in single active mode. Benefits here, we don't need to change anything with the gateways, don't need to change anything with the switches. We don't need we don't have any single point of failure and no switch is a single point of failure, no access PE is a single point of failure. And we can take all of these access devices in redundantly. And we can put the ends of the rings in separate locations. Furthermore, it reduces operational complexity because I don't need to manage pseudowire failovers and failbacks. I don't need to have any tracking of that. Everything's up and deterministically load balanced. So the point of this whole presentation is not necessarily that you should be doing one of these specific things. I will say scenario 1 is something that does fit a lot of use cases, and that is something that you might want to take in your environment. Scenario 2, maybe something like that fits you, but you're going to need to customize that to your environment, certainly. But the point here is EVPN is not a set of services. We talk about it a lot as it enables, this new functionality for layer 2 VPN for your customers. And it's not, it's another tool that you have in your tool chain, and you can use it inside your own network as well as just to enable customer services. You can enable your existing services and enhance those and add redundancy and resiliency to them through the new tools that we have. Thank you. So again, you can find me at any of these locations, and like Hugo, unfortunately, we are running a little bit over, but I will take questions in our session afterwards. So at this time, we are running quite a bit over, actually. Give me just 1 second. Okay, just wanted to do a time check here. So next, I'd like to run through our community updates. The first one is the obvious question, right? What is DisNOG? I know we kind of glazed over that real quickly. To understand that, I want to first cover what a NOG is. A NOG is network operators working together for a mutual benefit, fundamentally. Usually these take place as in-person meetings. We're not having that right now, right? This is a Discord-oriented network operators group. Typically, they are vendor neutral, which we are, although obviously I work for Juniper. The organization as a whole is vendor neutral, and we have people here with experience in all different vendors. NOGs do many things. All of these things work to help the network profession to do its job better. I like the way that NANOG covers this. Just quoting off of their website because it's great. They say, we're dedicated to the ongoing advancement of an open, secure, and robust internet by inspiring, educating, and empowering our community to meet the ever-changing demands of a global network. I like that, and it resonates here, right? This is what our goal is as well. We're just oriented a little bit differently. So why DisNOG? It's different from other NOGs. We have a global reach already. We're not focused on any specific geography, and we're accessible to all levels. The fact that above 40% of our user base is in, generally speaking, college or universities, some high school, is something that is fairly unique to NOGs, and it allows us to reach a different audience than most do. And it's the natural progression, right? It's where we want to go by bringing more content and more value to you. So what's changing? We're adding event programming. Obviously, that's what this is all about. They're going to be short meetings like this one, and we'll be bringing in some additional offerings as we can. There's some new ways to get involved, and we are constantly in need of presenters. We are constantly in need of event programming help. If you can get folks in your company to help, if anybody has interesting ideas, we welcome presenters from the outside. We also need sponsorship, right? None of this is free. You can see this little Zoom logo. That's because we only have the premium Zoom license, not the $140 a month webinar license, which would be nice so that we can do things in a little bit more of a technically advantageous way. But between that, the website, domain, everything, all of this costs money. So any help that we can get with things that could help us deliver better, not just financial, that would be wonderful. We have some new challenges. We're doing something totally new here that other folks haven't done before. This is just kind of a list of them. And we are navigating them, and I think we're doing a good job navigating them, I hope. But we're going to continue to have to do so. So a couple calls to action here. First one is join the LinkedIn group. This is another place to collaborate and bring people together who are involved in this community. Here's the link below. It's disnog.org/LinkedIn. And the next one is use your real name. This is totally optional. You don't have to, but because this is a professional community, it is nice to see each other as professionals and not an alias. And if you want to use your first name or full name, however you want to do it, we invite you to do that, but obviously there is no mandate to do so. And then there are a bunch of different ways that you can get involved and help this to be a success. We need development on the bot and the website. We need funds. There's currently a Patreon that helps me to afford all of the resources that we need for this. Your Discord Nitro boost can help us to make the server a little bit shinier. We need your opinions so you can suggest things on our GitHub issues. And we always need presenters. If you or somebody you know is interested in presenting an interesting topic for network engineers, please reach out to me. And finally, we know we have a bunch of creators here. So if you have a blog or a YouTube channel, if you're doing something interesting with creating content, reach out to Alan, and we can get your blog put up in the blogs channel for new posts. So thank you. That's it for community updates. I'd like to introduce Melchior Almans, who is going to talk with us about routing security and RPKI.
Right. Hello. Good day. So my name is Melchior. I live in the Netherlands, so you indeed have a very international audience. And I would first of all like to congratulate you with DisNOG. I think it's a really great initiative to bring network engineers together, and especially if it helps, as in the first talk, to bring more folks to the community and expose more people to network engineering roles. So yeah, so I work with Juniper. One of my interests is in routing security, as you could have guessed from the title. And today I would like to talk about RPKI and some options, how you could monitor if your own routes are being hijacked. Now I should be able to control. Right, okay, there we go. So in the perfect world, as you can see on our left side, we have our innocent user, and he or she is trying to reach a website which is running on IP address 198.51.0.10. And obviously, as how the internet works, BGP announces all those routes which are advertised from the data center on the right side. As you can see, it's a 198.51/22. And in the perfect world, because of BGP and how it works and a few mechanisms we have in place, this all works sort of magically perfectly fine. Now, the reason why that actually works quite well is because since BGP was, let's say, invented 30 years ago, we came up with quite a few bandages to keep it working. You have to imagine 30 years ago, when sort of the internet got started, everyone knew each other. So in the original specs of BGP, there were very little options for filtering and preventing stuff to happen. And the reason why it today works quite well is because we have a few mechanisms, right? Everyone has this prefix filters implemented. In other words, you do not accept default routes and RFC 1918, private IP space, etc. Some of you might be using peer lock, which is a mechanism that sort of specifies which ASN you should expect behind which peer. There is a mechanism which is called the big networks filter that basically states that it would be really awkward if behind your tier 2 peer you would see tier 1 routes. In other words, your tier 2 would be providing transit services to a tier 1 network. So in other words, you can implement a big networks filter by specifying which ASNs you will probably not see behind your peer. And obviously we filter bogon ASNs, bogon prefixes. I mentioned filter out long ASN path. It's always an interesting discussion. What is a too long path? I would say a path that is longer than 50 ASNs is probably not reasonable anymore. Obviously, we filter out small prefixes, everything in IPv4 from /24 up to /32. And obviously, we can use IRR databases for additional filtering on peers as well. So that works quite well, right? Because you probably know quite a few of your customers, or there's mechanisms in place that where a customer needs to declare what he will be advertising to you. You know quite a few of your peers, maybe from physical NOG meetings or mailing lists, etc. And you obviously have all your filters in place. However, prefix filters don't care about the originating ASN, right? The prefix filter only looks at the prefix itself, and it doesn't matter who is advertising the prefix. Peer log and big networks filter do not cover every network and are arbitrary. In other words, what is these days a tier 1 network, so a big network, right? In the early days, that would have been AT&T, NTT, and a couple of others. But these days, or today, that could also be Facebook, Google, AWS, for example. And then there is the exception that some of these large networks do actually peer with you. So you also want to be careful not to apply that big networks filter to one of the big networks you might be peering with. Filtering out small prefixes could be an interesting issue if you want to signal upstream a /24, for example, or smaller for DDoS mitigation. There's obviously downstream customers using private ASNs, and the biggest issue probably is that IRR databases are far from correct. You have to imagine the issue with IRR is that these days the quality is much better, but in the early days there were databases where I could make a statement in that database about resources I would not own. So in other words, I could put in that I would be advertising your prefixes from my ASN. Now, if someone else starts making routing decisions based on that, and I would be sort of hijacking your prefix, then that would obviously be an issue. So BGP hijacks are happening, right? Everyone probably has heard about a hijack, and here's a couple of them, of the recent ones listed. I don't know how often they happen, and I think the majority of them are not intentional. The majority of hijacks are unintentional, right? Fat fingers, advertising a full table over an IXP. I've done that in the past as well. A lot can go wrong because filters are still hard to build. Luckily, due to all these mechanisms we just mentioned, the impact is quite small. However, sometimes, as you can see in these examples where a data center leaked over 70,000 routes, that can become a huge issue. Another example of this is the My Ether wallet attack, for example, a couple of years ago, where some hijackers started advertising more specific routes so that they could reroute my Ethernet wallet traffic and actually steal cryptocurrency. So what in that case happens to our innocent user? Again, on the left side, here's our innocent user trying to reach a website that would normally be hosted in a data center. Because that IP address sits within that /22. Now, if a malicious actor starts advertising a more specific, a /23, as by nature, BGP now obviously prefers the more specific. And so our malicious actor will attract the traffic for that 23 and could do a man-in-the-middle attack, for example. This is the most simple example. There's obviously cases where someone would already advertise /24s and a malicious actor starts advertising a 24 as well. In that case, obviously there's something like ASPath, and in that case, part of the traffic could end up with the malicious actor. So now what? You probably have heard about origin validation using RPKI. And what is origin validation? Validation using the resource public key infrastructure. It's a mechanism to cryptographically sign records. And the interesting thing of these records is that it declares the intention of the resource holder. In other words, for the prefixes, I'm the legitimate holder with the IRR. I'm the one making those statements. So in the RPKI database is sort of comparable data as in the IRR database. However, you can be 100% sure that the one who made the declaration is the legitimate resource holder. In other words, I make a statement that my prefix might be or should be advertised by an ASN I specify, and it should be a specific length. Such a statement is called a ROA, a route origin authorization. And you create those in the database of your favorite IRR. In my case, that would be RIPE, because I'm in the Netherlands. But if you have resources with AP, Nick, or Aaron, for example, that's the place where you would create the ROAS for your resources. The next step is those ROAS can be downloaded by an operator using a validator. We'll get to that. And the next step then is you can use that information within that ROA to validate route advertisements you're receiving. So to go into it a little bit deeper, as I mentioned, step one is if you own prefixes, or I should say if you're the legitimate holder of a prefix, because the IRR still owns them and you're the holder, then you can go into the portal of your favorite IRR. You can create a statement, which is called a ROA. And that ROA is then being downloaded by a piece of software. That could be either a container or an application. There's a couple of them available. The validator downloads those ROAs. The validator takes care of the cryptographical heavy lifting to check if the ROAs are valid and if the whole certificate chain is valid as well. And if that's true, then they're placed into a validated cache. And the cache can then be downloaded by your border routers in order to perform that validation step. In many cases, the validator and the validated cache is a single piece of software, and we refer to that as the RPKI validator. The data that is sent from the validator to the router is called a VRP, or a validated ROA payload. So that is the validated or the payload of the ROA. And now in perfect world routing, if your routers are using those VRPs, then if you receive a route advertisement, in this case, again, it's 198.51/22 from AS64496. That should then match with a validated ROA payload. And in this case, that is true. So in this case, your route advertisement would be marked as valid and our user is able to connect. And you can be sure that your user is connecting to the right IP address. Now, if our malicious actor starts trying to hijack our route and inserts a /23 into the global routing table, in this case, also from a different ASN as the one that is specified in the VRP, then the router can drop that or should drop that advertisement because it doesn't match, the prefix length doesn't match as specified in the VRP, and the originating ASN doesn't match. So there's two reasons in this case to actually drop that route advertisement. That is called invalid is reject, or in other words, all these advertisements that you receive, and that's a couple of thousand in the global routing table at the moment, you should drop. There is still documentation out there that tries to convince you to lower the preference on an invalid route advertisement, but that doesn't really help you because, as we earlier saw, BGP would still prefer the more specific over the less specific. So even lowering the preference doesn't work. The issue is that, let me start with the good thing. The good thing is that currently close to 30-ish% of the global routing table is covered by valid ROAS. So you're able to, if you would implement RPKI and you start validating your route advertisements, then you can be sure that 30% is valid. The issue, as you can immediately see, is that 70-ish% is not found. In other words, there is no ROA present for 70% of the global routing table. So we'll get to that in the call to action. Please start validating, or at least start creating ROAS, as we saw. And the next step, obviously, start validating route advertisements. So let's say you have implemented RPKI, but someone else hijacks your routes, right? In this case, you're the data center, so you're advertising 198.51/22 towards your BGP upstreams, and our malicious actor starts now advertising a more specific of your route. How do you know? There's obviously BGPmon and quite a few other tools, but there's options to monitor that internally in your network as well. So let's take a look how that is being done. And obviously the next step then would be to counter that hijack and start advertising more specifics yourself, right? So in this case, if our hijacker starts advertising a /23 out of our 22, then if we would start advertising 24s, then we would still attract all the traffic. Again, this is not 100% perfect, as if our malicious actor starts advertising 24s as well, then we'll end up in a situation where part of the traffic would still end up in our data center, but another part of the traffic would end up with our malicious actor. So 3 steps to detect and mitigate route hijacks using automation. Step 1 is create a prefix list on your router that is going to be your source of truth. And obviously you would put in that prefix list your own prefixes or prefix you might want to monitor, right? It could be interesting to monitor prefixes of your top 10 traffic, for example. Second step then would be to check if someone is hijacking your routes, right? And that is where automation comes into place. So a continuous closed loop comparison between the routes you receive with the prefix list we build in step 1. And the third step is then to mitigate that attack by advertising more specifics to the hijack route or specifics routes that are the same at least as the hijack prefixes. So step 1 is quite easy, build our source of truth. As I'm with Juniper, I'm showing here Juniper configuration, but obviously you can do this on Arista, Cisco, Nokia, and others as well, Bird. We build our prefix list, we call it AES 64496 prefixes, and in this case we only have one prefixes, which is our /22. Then the next step is to use that prefix list in a policy. In this case we call it our hijack check, and what it does, it takes routes, it looks at the routes you receive from BGP and matches those against our prefix list. If a route in that prefix list or longer, so more specific, appears in the routes we are receiving from our BGP neighbors, then we add a community named hijacked, which is community 64496/666, and we obviously reject the announcement. And on the right side, you can see how in Juniper that policy would be applied as an import policy. So now our router can distinguish which, if it receives routes, in this case, our own or more specifics compared to our own routes. And obviously in the example that is true. So if we do a show route community and we match on that community we defined, then we see that there is a more specific being announced. And this is where, as I mentioned, that closed loop automation comes into place. As this would be in an example from a tool that Juniper has, Paragon. This is how the dashboard would show that your route is being hijacked. This is an example where we've been using private IP space, but you get the idea. And then obviously the next step to that is to have your automation insert a, in this case, 2 static routes into a router, the 2/24s we've seen a couple of slides back. We obviously want to discard them and not install them in forewarning because we only want to use them to advertise more specifics. So this is to give you an idea how you could use automation in order to mitigate route hijacks in your network. So as I mentioned, a call to action. The first thing is obviously create ROAS for your own resources, even if you are not ready to start validating routes yourself, so you've not set up a validator and you're not ready to configure RPKI yet, then at least create ROAS for your own prefixes so other networks can start validating your route announcements. Obviously, the next two steps are to set up a validator and configure your routers for RPKI. And there's quite some work still going on in the different IRRs and in IETF to even further fine-tune origin validation and the next steps after origin validation, because we're not there yet, right? We're now able to perform origin validation so we can check if route advertisements are announced from the right ASN. However, what now if someone starts advertising your prefixes from your ASN? And if you then have a ROA, that would mean that he or she is advertising a valid announcement. In other words, there's still work going on, and that would be AS path validation. There's a few drafts in IETF, ASPA and AS cones. Due to lack of time, it goes a little bit too deep to go into these, but basically what ASPA does is it works sort of the same as in origin validation, right? I can specify that if you are my upstream, that you're allowed to re-advertise my ASN. In other words, I can authorize you to advertise everything that is behind my ASN. And that way you can build a validated AS path. AS cones takes it the other way around. It looks very much as RPSL for those who are familiar with that. And so how it works is I create a cone that specifies my downstream ASNs. So in other words, that makes it a little bit easier perhaps for service providers who have a lot of stop networks behind them. And if I don't want to burden them with all the RPKI stuff, etc., then I can create a cone, specify my customers, and my upstream creates a cone that includes my cone. So we build the tree the other way around. There's much of work going on there in the CIDR Ops and Grow working groups in IETF. So please check it out and send your comments and ideas to the respective mailing lists. I do have some time, I think, for questions. So if there are questions, please do let me know now. Else, if you want, you can always send me an email or find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever your favorite social media tool is. I'm also happy to help you if you have any questions around creating ROAS or setting up validators, configuring your routers, feel free to reach out.
Hi, Melchior. In the Discord channel, we have a Q&A channel where people have been asking questions. 3 questions have come in. So let me get started if I could ask you a question.
Go ahead. First
one's come from Jason. He asks, is there a good source or standard for this big networks filter? Is anyone out there perhaps publishing this as a feed of things that change, and do we need to worry about change?
Yeah, there is a source, and that source is on, let me see if I can find it this quickly. It should be on, here we are, on bgpfilterguide.nlnog.net. There, I will post a link in the Discord channel as well right after this. But it is very arbitrary, as I mentioned, but it gives a nice place to start.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. Are you aware of anybody running a validator directly on their routers? Is there a reason that we shouldn't do this?
Excellent question. I haven't mentioned that. The reason why we prefer to run a validator off box is because the whole cryptographic side is kind of CPU intensive, right? Currently, with just 30-ish% of the global routing table being covered by ROAS, it's still reasonable, but the more ROAS created, the more crypto, how do you say that? Crypto lifting is needed. So preferably, that's the reason why they're being run off box. I know that Arista has done some tests with running a validator on box. I don't know if they actually offer that. But yeah, that's the reason why it's run off box, because, for example, that's the reason why BGP-SEC doesn't scale, right? You don't want to burden your control plane with all this cryptographic heavy lifting.
Okay, great. Last question. For those of us who only have a /24, or maybe we experience a /24 hijack, what is the best defense we have to hijack back, as we can't use a more specific route?
Yeah, excellent question. The good thing is that all your direct peers will prefer the path towards you. So in that case, my advice would be to peer with as many networks as possible. Because if both yourself and our malicious actors advertising a /24, then the shortest AS path wins. So if you are the one having the majority of peerings, or at least you have many direct peerings, then the chance that someone will end up on your network instead of our malicious actors network is quite big. So peer with as many networks as possible.
Great advice. Thank you for answering our questions.
All right, no worries. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you again for coming to present. Definitely appreciate it. I would like to take a couple minutes because both myself and Hugo didn't have time for questions. I'd like to move back to those if there are questions. So let me see if I can find the appropriate slides. There we go. So do we have any questions for Hugo Harley?
We do, yeah. We've got a couple. Hi Hugo, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir, I can. Yeah.
Perfect. So the first question is there any particular reason to choose networking over any other sort of subfield within IT, such as sysadmin or software development?
Yeah, so for myself, I kind of came in through the sysadmin route and advanced through there into a bit of architecture as well. The thing that drew me to network engineering was a little bit more the determinism that I found in networking, as opposed to more general systems administration, specifically coming from a managed services world where there's end user support. The type of systems you're interacting with, there's just a lot of component. You've got various levels of the hardware drivers from various vendors, applications, end user behavior. So there's a lot of factors going on there. So I really appreciated and how my brain works, I guess. Networks, comparatively speaking, there's fewer of those factors, and if it's broken, you probably broke it, or there are physical world, like there's a fiber cut or whatnot. So that was quite appealing to me, to kind of get started on that path. I have actually since also leaned more into the software development, scripting, building tooling side of it. And that's been more in support of what I'm doing within network engineering. So the benefit and the things that really draw me to the development side are being able to solve problems and basically making less work for myself, right? Like when we're doing a data center capacity build, rather than having to allocate a whole bunch of inventory and things manually, I can build tooling to wrap that around and make it more consistent as well. So I have found that, having come through the sysadmin side of things has given me an advantage now that as I'm working more on pure network engineering, I can relate to our development and our systems teams and kind of speak their language. So that's, I would encourage folks to complement, whatever their primary skill set is with some of these other aspects, but do have I kind of put that in the chat of, have a primary focus and become more like, here's your network engineering focus, and then round it out with some other things to support that.
Perfect. Okay, I've got another. I have another question. I'm going to ask the third question
Mhm.
second, because I think
Sure.
it ties into what was
Yeah.
what you were just saying there. But
Yeah.
I've got a question around what's your opinion on Cisco DevNet? Should I stay sort of focused only on network engineering, or should I
Mhm.
also get something from DevNet? I heard it's not good to mix these two things. If I want to become a specialist in network engineering, then I shouldn't mix it with programming. What
Right.
are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's you're right. That does kind of lead into how I answered the previous one of that. I would say that trying to become an expert in both, especially off the bat, you're going to overload yourself. You know, I know very few people, and I mean like count them on one hand, that can manage, that have gotten in their careers to being expert software developers and expert network engineers. There's just very deep fields and a lot, like beyond just writing a script, but actually getting it productionized and production ready. There's a lot there and a lot of tooling and kind of its own world. I would not say don't do both. I would say start with a focus. And in my experience, there's when you start, especially doing any kind of like network programming, and by that I mean things that manipulate active forwarding of the network, that I have like a bit of skittishness if you have folks that come from a pure, like from the software development side and then start implementing those types of systems, where I have much more confidence, just for the potential impact on networks, right? If you can find folks that specialize and start in network engineering, and then take on some of these other DevNet and automation type skills, because you're starting with the fundamentals and the foundational knowledge of how networks function and what the problems are and the risks, and then you can complement you know, a development lens to it, I guess. I do still think that it's very helpful if you're going to be building anything that actually is interacting with and manipulating the network. Pairing is fantastic, right? Find somebody that's an expert software or expert network engineer and has a bit of development understanding, and find an expert software development with a bit of network understanding, and blend. You've got a massive power team between that, right? And that can also help you develop as a developer, to see how they function. So
Yeah, that's good advice. So the last question then, I guess, is one of the things we often see on the Discord is people asking, I'm new to networking, I want to pick up an entry-level cert. I've been thinking about the CCNA, but maybe I should get my Network Plus first. What are your thoughts on the first cert that people should maybe pick up? Is the Network Plus worth it, or is it okay to just start with something like the CCNA?
Right. Yeah. My own path. I did actually do the Network Plus first. The program I did that I mentioned, like it stacked a whole bunch of certs, but it was also assuming like a 0 to foundation kind of approach, and you know, getting folks through the A plus and the generic Network Plus was helpful to accomplish that. And I think the Cisco certs and the vendor certs, like specifically the CCNA, has been restructured quite a lot since. Like it was quite daunting when you just take it as one big lump. Whereas with things like ICND and how they've shifted some of the CCNA program itself, I think it's not quite as daunting anymore, and it's more amenable to coming at it out of the gate. I would still probably recommend, like, if folks have zero exposure to tech whatsoever and they're like, I want to take a run at this, starting right into that like associate level cert might be a little bit challenging if you don't have some foundation, and that's where something like Network Plus can be helpful. But if you've got, you know, you've been playing around with things and you've got a bit of understanding, then you're not missing anything, in my opinion, if you skip Network Plus and go to CCNA. It's more just if you feel comfortable, start exploring it, look at what the content is. And if you're like, I have no idea what these words mean, maybe it's good to find a bit of start first and then take it. But otherwise, go for it.
Cool, nice one, thank you.
Cheers.
I think that's all the questions.
Awesome, thanks.
So Harley, were there any questions for me?
That's a good question. Let me check.
I think I saw one in there at least. I have not, unfortunately, been reading every message in the event Q&A as presentations have been going on, but
Yeah, there's one question.
okay.
Okay. While EVPN is industry standard, have you experienced any issues in multi-vendor environments? For companies that are looking to spread their hardware across multiple vendors, is it possible to, for instance, run different vendors for the gateway routers, or is there enough vague language in the RFCs that this becomes an issue?
Yeah, so I can't say that I've actually done multi-vendor EVPN. I can tell you what I have heard from experiences from others is that it works, right? In fact, in the data center environment specifically, there are some orchestration tools that will go in and they'll set the standard. You might need to do some tuning of knobs to get things to work ideally together. And some of these orchestration tools will come with some of that like out of the box. You get that best interoperability. But they are standards, they should work together. That being said, I would, going into a production environment, I would either do a lot of lab work or better yet, stick with keeping things that are maybe paired the same, not just the same vendor, the same hardware, right? The same hardware, the same software version. That's just probably a good practice in general in network engineering. But those two gateway routers, unless you're willing to spend a lot of time ironing out any potential issues in the lab, what I would do is take the two gateway routers and choose vendor A, and the two PE routers maybe vendor B. And the same can go in the data center use case too, right? Best practices, keep the same device as your spine. And if you want a different vendor for your leaf, then fine. But that's just probably an easy way to keep things sane so that you're not having to manage a lot of complexity between vendors. Anything else?
I'm not seeing any other questions, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, we'll, I guess, conclude the live sessions here. What I will say before we move on is go fill out that survey. The URL's on there, disnog.org/survey. If you fill out the survey, you provide your Discord username and discriminator or the Discord tag. You'll be eligible for a drawing for a free JetBrains license. And yes, we do have a sponsorship finally, that is JetBrains. So they're our first one, and they will be giving us free licenses for some of their products, which I know a lot of us use PyCharm for our Python needs. If you're seeing this and you're not already a member, come join us on the Discord server via disnog.org/join. It is absolutely free, and we'd love to have you and have some discussions with you. At this point, we'll conclude this, and we'll move on to voice chat in general VC on Discord. Can all join there now, and we will have discussions around presentations, around any changes that happened. And then we'll move on to just social conversation as you see fit. If you would like to grab a drink, if that's your thing, you're welcome to do so. All right, I'll talk to you there. Thank you very much.